no taxes, free housing, and free tuition. You've probably seen those claims online about Indian status, but are they actually true? Hey, I'm Jesse Andrushko, editor of APTN News InFocus, and today we're fact-checking some of the most common myths about Indian status. InFocus is taking a break for the summer, so while we're away, we're sharing some of our other work with you. My colleague Savannah Kelly and I recently launched a new YouTube series called APTN News Answers, where we break down questions, current events, and issues affecting Indigenous peoples. According to the latest census, more than 830,000 First Nations people in Canada are registered under the Indian Act. There are plenty of misconceptions about what status does and doesn't provide, so we dug into the facts. Here's that episode of APTN News Answers.
What is Indian status and what can it be used for? We see a lot of comments online about the benefits First Nations people get, like tax exemptions, free housing, free education. But what is the truth about Indian status and the reality of these so-called free aspects? I'm Savannah Kelly.
I'm Jesse Andrushko, and this is APTN News Answers.
So Jesse, a big inspiration for us even creating this series comes from comments we see online. So again, we've seen a lot of comments online about what First Nations people receive because they have Indian status. But before we start looking into some of these and separating fact from fiction, we should talk about what Indian status actually is.
Yeah, so Indian status is a legal identity for First Nations people in the Indian Register under the Indian Act. The Indian Act was first introduced by the federal government in 1876 and was used as a colonial tool for Canada to administer Indian status, manage reserve lands, and essentially lay out laws aimed at assimilating First Nations people. It's been revised several times since its creation, but it remains a controversial piece of legislation that has enabled generations worth of injustice on First Nations people. There's even been calls to abolish it. It wasn't until 1956 that the Canadian government introduced the official certificate of Indian status, which was used to confirm an individual's Indian status and prove eligibility for certain rights and federal programs. In the early days, these were made of paper, then laminated paper, before becoming plastic, which are used today. So it pretty much just looks like a driver's license.
So in short, status cards, they're a form of government ID issued to First Nations people who are registered under the Indian Register as having Indian status. And to be clear, before we move on and start talking about other things to do with Indian status, we can talk about the fact that the term Indian is outdated, often derogatory, and, not to mention historically inaccurate, but it is still a term that's used legally within the context of the Indian Act today.
Yeah, definitely an important thing to mention. So when we talk about rights and benefits that people who have status can access, it is important to keep in mind that these rights, one, stem from colonial law that was not created with the intention of helping First Nations people, but with the intention of controlling and eventually assimilating them. And two, that none of these rights and benefits are truly free. The federal government has certain obligations to status First Nations people through the Indian Act and treaties. But now that we covered that, let's move on to misconceptions that we see online. One that we see a lot is housing. What's the truth behind that?
The truth is, we could do a whole video just dedicated on First Nations housing. But for now, we're talking about Indian status. Let's focus on the misconception we see a lot online that First Nations people living on reserve get free houses. We see it a lot in our comment section on our APTN News platforms. The first thing that you need to know about First Nations housing is that it doesn't function the same way as housing in the rest of the country. So if you were looking to get a house anywhere else in Canada, you would either buy the property, become the private property owner, or you would lease it and become a renter. Whereas First Nations, under the Indian Act, all the land that makes up First Nations in Canada is actually legally owned by the Crown, the federal government, but it's set aside for the collective use of First Nations. So that means that, houses in First Nations are granted to First Nations people to live in, but they are owned by the First Nation as a collective in most cases. So band members given the right to live in houses in the community, they do not own them. And in many cases, First Nations people will either pay rent or an occupation fee to live in those houses, but it's really up to the discretion of the community. Some First Nations will charge rent or occupancy fees. Other First Nations do not.
I will say that does kind of sound like free housing.
Yeah. So in short, yes, First Nations people, you can be granted a house to live in and, not pay rent in First Nations, but that's not the universal truth for people living in those communities. And there's also other context when it comes to First Nations housing that's important to keep in mind. So it's not instant. You don't walk into your band office and say, I want a house. And they're like, oh, great, we have just the place for you. It often requires people to sit on waiting lists with their band office for years or sometimes indefinitely because the demand far outweighs the supply. And also, a lot of those homes are in need of varying levels of repair. So if you're watching this channel, you're watching APTN News, you might have heard that there's a housing crisis on First Nations in Canada, which is true. Many communities, they simply don't have enough houses, which again leads to issues like waiting lists, which then feeds into issues like overcrowding. The Assembly of First Nations says that 25% of First Nations households in the country are affected by overcrowding, which is nearly 7 times the rate of overcrowding for non-Indigenous households in the country. And again, the houses that do exist, they're not always in the greatest condition. The Assembly of First Nations put out a report in 2023 about closing the infrastructure gap on First Nations by 2030. And what the report said is, despite Indigenous Services Canada providing yearly funding for houses on First Nations, it's not enough to address a century of systemic underfunding on First Nations. So there's a lot of work to be done. And the AFN says that this history of underfunding has led to a shortfall in even home maintenance. So maintaining the homes that already exist on First Nations, which then feeds into homes deteriorating sooner than they should. So another study by the Assembly of First Nations in 2021 estimated that 34% of homes on First Nations were in need of minor repairs and 31% required major repairs.
There was a recent landmark court decision involving Canada's obligation to provide on-reserve housing. How does that relate?
It's a great question. So it was a class action lawsuit filed in 2023 by the St. Teresa Point and Sandy Lake First Nations in Ontario on behalf of their communities and other First Nations affected by the housing crisis. Their case argued that Canada's failure to provide adequate housing to First Nations violated the charter rights of First Nations people, as well as Canada's fiduciary duties to First Nations people. So this decision actually came out pretty recently, December 5th, 2025. The judge ruled that Canada indeed does have a legal and fiduciary duty and obligation to First Nations people that stems back to the Indian Act. So if this case moves forward, the next step will be to decide in court whether Canada failed in these legal duties. So step 1 of the court case was, does Canada have these duties? The judge says yes. Now the next case will be, did they fail in these duties? And if so, what needs to be done to correct the situation? Our colleague, Karen Pugliese, wrote a great piece, as we know, about this landmark ruling. We will put a link to it in the video description so you can go and check it out to kind of get more information about what this court case is all about, because it's a very interesting read. So to sum up, free housing on reserve does exist, but with a lot of caveats.
Key being on reserve. So this doesn't include many First Nations people in Canada.
Exactly. So First Nations people, many of them live off reserve, so they're not benefiting from this option of being granted a home to live in on a First Nation. But, after everything we've just discussed about it, there's a lot of people living on reserve on First Nations that aren't benefiting either. But you touched on something actually interesting that's going to come up in a couple of these other aspects of Indian status, which is there are certain benefits that really only apply to First Nations people that live and or work on reserve. Another one of those benefits we see a lot in our comments section is taxes. So, that's tax exemption on purchases. First Nations people don't pay tax on anything, income tax exemption. So yeah, is this true? Is there something more we should know?
Some of these tax exemptions are real, but under specific circumstances. So let's start with First Nations people earning tax-free income from their jobs, for instance. That can be true, but it has to be under specific circumstances that end up excluding many working First Nation people. For example, for someone with Indian status to earn tax-free income, that income must be earned while on reserve. That's the most straightforward way. You have status and your job is located within a First Nation community. Or in other cases, if the job duties are carried out off reserve but are in service of a First Nation or a First Nation organization that is located on reserve.
Okay, so in short, if someone wants to earn tax-free income as a First Nations person registered under the Indian Act, they would either have to work on reserve at a First Nation or work at a satellite office that's connected to a main office that is located on reserve.
Yes, but it is a bit more nuanced than that. In general, to be exempt from income tax while working off reserve, you need to work for either a First Nation band itself, a tribal council representing one or more First Nation bands that have reserves, or an organization controlled by a band or tribal council, and only if the organization works directly for the benefit of First Nations people who mostly live on reserve, or work off reserve in a job that provides some services to First Nation members that is directly connected to a First Nation. The key is the job needs to have the connection to a First Nation. It's straightforward if the worker is employed on reserve, but a bit more complicated if they're off reserve work. There are more specifics to determine whether the income will be tax-free in special cases, like the percentage of work that is carried out on reserve, but this is all just general guidelines. If you're watching this and you think you might be eligible for income tax exemption, do your research first and consult a tax professional, because there's been a lot of people who've been caught up by surprise thinking they've been tax exempt, but then having to owe thousands of dollars.
So if the tax man comes knocking, please don't blame us. Before we move on from taxes, another aspect we should talk about is tax-free sales purchases. Like you go into a store and you're not paying tax. What's the truth in there?
Yeah, that's not entirely true. What is true is that First Nations people with status usually don't pay sales tax for purchases that happen specifically on reserve, like at a store or gas station, for example. But it's also true for purchases that are delivered to a First Nation by a vendor or their agent, like Canada Post or other carriers. A good example of this would be buying a vehicle from a dealership. If a First Nation person bought a vehicle off reserve, but had the dealership deliver the vehicle to them on reserve, the buyer would pay no sales tax on that purchase as long as they showed their proper document, which would be like a status card or called a temporary confirmation of registration document. That's basically a document that confirms that a person is registered under the Indian Act.
That's an interesting example, but as with many things in this country, there are differences on a province by province basis. So is there any extra layer of context we can look at for the provinces?
It generally works the same across most provinces. Ontario's rules are a bit more open. Like other provinces, purchases also need to be delivered by a vendor to reserve in order to be fully tax exempt. But unlike other provinces, Ontario has a tax exemption on the 8% provincial sales tax on purchases of goods and services at the point of sale by showing a status card off reserve. So that could be meals, gas, electronics, etc. Despite provincial guidelines on tax exemptions, you may have a different experience at the cash register. Some businesses will remove the tax at the point of sale. Other businesses will issue a receipt for the consumer to get reimbursed after the fact, and some businesses will just straight up deny tax exemptions. So results may vary.
As is the case with a lot of things in life, honestly. You mentioned gas. That's another one that we see online a lot, and not as much as some of these other misconceptions, but there is a misconception that First Nations people get free gas. So the reality of this is essentially your First Nations, you would have to be filling up your tank on reserve or in Ontario to be tax exempt.
Exactly. No one is getting free gas. But depending on where your gas up, you could be tax exempt on the purchase. The free gas claim is a pretty common misconception, especially after Justin Bieber in 2012 was quoted in Rolling Stones magazine as saying he was part Aboriginal and could get free gas in Canada. That's really all it takes for a misconception to just get amplified.
Absolutely.
Which makes me think of another thing people bring up, hunting and fishing. What are the rules behind that? Can people just literally hunt and fish all they want?
Hunting and fishing is an interesting one. Again, it varies by province in how it's enforced, but in general, the rights are clear. Treaty rights are recognized under Section 35 of the Constitution. So this means people with status can hunt and fish for food without bag limits, without seasonal restrictions, specifically on Crown land.
Crown land being land owned by the federal and provincial governments, which actually makes up most of the country.
Exactly. So 89% of Canada is Crown land. So that includes forests, prairies, riverbeds, shorelines. First Nations hunters can use those lands, but not everywhere because, each province has rules. You can't hunt on private land without permission, and some areas are off limits. This could include provincial parks, ecological reserves. In Manitoba, for example, there are no set season limits or bag limits, but there are still rules. You need to be safe while doing it. You can't shoot from the side of a road or a highway. And in most cases, you have to make sure you have your status card on you because if a conservation officer comes up, you need to be able to prove that you have those rights.
Makes sense. So Crown land only in specified areas and not on private land without permission.
Exactly. And just to be clear, having status doesn't mean the rules are always the same for everyone. It all depends on the treaty and where you are.
Yeah, and that's where conflict comes in, depending on the region.
Exactly. But that's a whole other topic that we could save for a future video. But another aspect of having status that we should talk about is education. So post-secondary education is expensive, and it has the added challenge of First Nation students often having to move away from their home communities to more urban areas in order to even access the ability to attend these programs and get their education and whatever their goals are. So having status can help First Nation students access money, which removes barriers to post-secondary education. So the main pathway they can do that through is Canada's Post-Secondary Student Support Program, which is made for Status First Nation students, and it can help with tuition, textbooks, living allowances, and travel support. So students can apply to this through their Regional Indigenous Services Canada office, or a lot more commonly just through the band office in their community. It's not as easy as walking in with your status card, waving it and saying, I'd like one education, please. Like, there are parameters to it. So first of all, you need to have decent grades. And even then, the funding is limited. So not every student in a community will necessarily get funding for that school year, even if they have satisfactory grades. And also, in addition to that, the funding is good for one school year. So students will need to reapply for every year that they're attending university.
So really, it's like a bursary. And that means calling it free education kind of minimizes what's actually happening. It's not guaranteed to anyone who applies, and it's limited funding that stems from Indigenous Services Canada.
Exactly. And the living expenses aspect of it is usually not enough to live on its own. So even First Nation students that are receiving this funding for this, so-called free education, they will often work a part-time job just like anyone else.
So we've covered the main misconceptions we see online about status cards. Is there anything else that we should mention?
Yes, there are a few things I want to talk about. They're not misconceptions, but there are other things that First Nations people with Indian status can access, which I think are worth mentioning. So the first one is the non-insured health benefits program. And so this helps First Nations people access more specialized healthcare in addition to Canada's universal basic healthcare. So this includes, dental, vision care, coverage for prescription drugs, medical equipment, wheelchairs, prosthetics, things like that, and more. The second thing that they can use is using a status card as ID when crossing the border into the US, specifically by land or sea. You can't use it if you're flying and landing in an airport. But this one, it's not really recommended to do this anymore because the acceptance of an Indian status card as ID is really at the discretion of a US border agent. So it's kind of more of a fun fact at this point than a true benefit that people can use their status for. And even the Assembly of First Nations is warning people, don't cross the border without another accepted form of government issued ID like a Canadian passport. Thought it was worth mentioning, but again, do not try and cross the border with just your status card because the results very much will vary. And the last one I want to mention is treaty annuity payments. So each year, the federal government pays First Nations people who are registered under the Indian Act and are affiliated with a First Nation that's under one of the signed treaties in Canada. So this payment is a treaty obligation of the federal government, and the government claims the payment is, like a symbol of the relationship between the Crown and First Nations people. But the reality is that these payments were meant to partially compensate First Nations for lands lost. But the $5 that they're getting paid has not kept up with inflation or increased. So is $5 per person per year really much of a benefit in 2026? You be the judge.
Yeah, $5, say that's not going to get you very far, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. Hopefully this adds some clarity to the misconceptions surrounding Indian status and status cards. A big takeaway here is that these aspects of having Indian status are not freebies. They all stem from the obligations the Crown has to First Nations people through the Indian Act and signed treaties.
Exactly. And again, pretty much every topic we've talked about in this video could be a video unto itself. And, maybe we'll save those deep dives for another day. But yeah, hopefully this clears things up a bit.
If you have any questions about status, or if there's anything we missed, or if there's another topic you want us to dive in on, email us at answers@aptn.ca. But otherwise, this has been another episode of APTN News Answers. I'm Jesse Andrushko.
And I'm Savannah Kelly. Thank you for watching.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more APTN News Answers videos on the APTN News YouTube channel. I'm Jesse Andrushko. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.